Welcome back to The Nuance. Today is my first live call with one of you, everyday people trying to make health and fitness a part of your life, hoping that I can make how to do so a little bit more clear and a little bit easier. So today I'm on with Joelle. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being brave enough to be my first guest. These are going to be as casual as I could possibly make them. I want to try and mimic and mirror what I typically do when I have people come to me inquiring about one-on-one coaching. And this initial call really is just kind of getting to know each other a little bit, but also getting a feel for what your goals are, what you've been trying to do in order to achieve them, and how we can potentially manipulate those habits, behaviors, and systems a little bit to get you moving in the right direction if you feel a little bit stuck. And I have a little bit of background information from some, just on my calls, I call them application notes, but just kind of like a goal form that you filled out in terms of what you're trying to achieve. But I don't ever like putting words into people's mouths. And so if you could just kind of share with me what you're trying to do right now, what a little bit of like your strategies are, what you've tried in the past, what's gone well, what hasn't, and why you feel stuck or like you could use some help at this point.
No, I appreciate the intro, not info. I'm still asleep, so I apologize for that.
It is early. Are you on Eastern Standard Time?
I'm on Mountain Time, so it's 7:30 in the morning where I'm at.
Okay. Personally, I'm a first thing in the morning. I do all of my client check-ins at like 5:30 a.m. So
Nice.
I am very much used to. I'm kind of halfway through my day at this point, but yeah, it's early to actually be productive for most people who don't start their days that way.
No, fair enough. I usually get up with my husband at 5, see him off, and then I slowly wake up. But to get back to your question, so I've been working out off and on for better part of a decade kind of deal. And lately, specifically within the last year, I've discovered I actually like doing cardio exercises after years of being like, I don't like being out of breath, don't like running unless I'm being chased by a zombie, give me a good reason to run, then I'll run kind of deal.
Right.
But within the last year, especially during the warmer months, I'm like, cool, I feel like I can power my body like I'm a machine. I can run even though it's a very slow pace. That's great. But my ultimate goal right now is to continue to improve my cardiovascular health. And with the colder months, that's been getting trickier with snow and ice on the ground, and it just being in the low 30s, high 20s during the winter times. So I think that's where I'm kind of stuck in a rut, between cold weather, and then also if I don't do a solid enough warm up, my knees will end up being puffy by the end of it, even though it's walk-run intervals still. So I'm trying to figure out like why. What are you guys doing? Like, we've been working on adapting to running for over a year now. Why is this still a thing? Thankfully, it's not as frequently, but it's still a thing that happens on occasion now.
Wanted to jump in there and just kind of,
Go
it's
ahead.
a joke, but one of the things that I would say that you could solve your problem with the cold weather is to do what I do and just leave it, escape it, or do what I did rather. I grew up in the northern part of the country, grew up in Pennsylvania, and the cold, the winter, the snow was just not for me, never has been. I went for a walk this morning and it's 75, probably almost 80 at this point at 9:30 in the morning, sunshine. My wife and I, one of the things she said was, I don't love everything about Florida, but this is nice, the sun, you know what I mean? So you could just move somewhere that's warmer. But isn't it kind of funny how that is the type of advice that sometimes does actually get given to people, where it's kind of actually unrealistic? Like, yeah, it might be simple. The easiest, the simplest thing, the most basic thing is the most unrealistic, right?
Yeah.
Get out of the cold. You do, I think in the notes you did say you have a treadmill that you have access to, right? You have the treadmill at work, I believe, correct? So that is an option to kind of like avoid the cold, but certainly that's an obstacle and a barrier.
Yeah.
And the other aspect too does require, in terms of like the knee pain, the things that are happening there from kind of like a barrier that you're running into with the training, that in tandem with the whole, like, are you actually adapting appropriately? What are you doing? Does require a little bit of discussion to see kind of like, okay, is there something actually wrong with your approach? Because when anybody asks me, like, why isn't this working, or why is this happening when it comes to any type of training adaptations, building muscle, changing the way that we look, improving our cardiovascular fitness, it usually boils down to one of three things, I would say. The first one being there's actually something missing or something wrong with the actual training approach, the plan, the programming, the, mileage, the volume, the intensity, all of those variables, right? Something is off. Or overall recovery from that, which I guess kind of could be lumped into the same category, but there's a recovery issue. So we're not sleeping enough, stress is too high, so on and so forth. And then kind of in tandem with that too is kind of like the segueing off the recovery pieces. Are we consuming enough food and calories to support that work that we're doing so that we can actually do what really matters? And that's recover from and adapt to the training. I think a lot of people look towards like the work, the effort that goes into it, and don't pair it enough with what's required in order to actually get from it what we're looking to get from it. So my first question with that is, how long, with what you're currently doing, the kind of like intervals, which I think you said you've worked up to at this point, 6 miles, or not 6 miles. That'd probably be impressive, right?
I'm not quite there. I'm like, oh, did I?
Yeah, 6 minutes of running and or jogging, right? So active work paired with 1 minute of walking. And are you doing that like multiple times over? Are you doing rounds of that at this point?
So for each of those, for that one, for example, I think it was like five cycles of that.
Okay, so you're going for like 30 plus minutes then at this
Yes.
point.
Yes.
Okay, so how long have you been doing that for? Like, is this a very new thing? Like this realization that you said at the beginning, like, hey, I actually kind of like running, like cardio at this point. When did that happen? Like, are we talking about last month or maybe 6 months ago?
So it started actually coming up on a year ago, because I've
Okay,
worked with, because I know your company, Level 10, joined forces recently with SD Evolution,
right.
if I'm correct on that.
Levolution now. Yes.
Yeah, the Levolution now. It's a fun new new
Yeah, it makes
combination.
sense, right? It just kind of
Yeah,
fits.
yeah, it does. So I had worked with Coach Robin on the SD
Cool, cool.
on that side of things, and I was like, my cardio sucks. She's like, okay, well, there's this app you can use, and it'll help you work up through the intervals. So I want to say it was about a year, maybe even a year and a half ago at this point, where I'm like, cool, I enjoy running, but I don't want to do too much too quick, kind of deal, because I've done that before, and at one point, I think 5 years ago, I tried to run 8 miles, and my body was wrecked for like 3 weeks after. It wasn't a race or anything. I was just
Yeah,
like, I want to see how long I can run for.
I've been there.
I'm not
The
doing that
older we
again.
get, the older we get, the more our body hits us back when we do stuff like that without preparing for it. Our
It gets
team has
very
been
mean.
discussing, yeah, angry. Our team has been discussing doing like a meetup, a get together since the merge. And one of the things that came up is like, let's do a Spartan race or something like that. And I did a Tough Mudder once in my life 10 years ago when I was 22 years old. And for that, no training. I said, I'll do it, but I don't care. I'm just going to show up. And it was fine. I maybe a day after I was sore or whatnot. I would, just like you said, not even 3 days, maybe 3 weeks, I would be paying for that at this point. So yeah, the older that we get, the more it's required that you have to start to acclimate into these things. So I'm assuming you've acclimated up to those. Even 30 minutes at a time, I would say, is something that is further, that's not a starting point we would necessarily want to have.
Yeah, yeah, correct. I'm still wanting to like I want to be able to get into running up to like 30 minutes straight, for example, without needing
The
to
walking
take,
intervals.
yeah, without the walking intervals, and also without feeling the need to only run once a week just to give my body, specifically my knees, enough time to recover between sessions. Like I would love to do running 3 times a week because it just feels good while I'm running. It's like I am my own machine engine. This is great. I don't have to ride a bike and like get that going. And so running's just been. It's also the easier form of cardio I found to get access to. I mean, you get the right kind of
It's
shoes.
accessible.
Yeah,
Right.
it's very accessible versus like limited access to a treadmill or a Peloton bike or things like that. You just warm up, throw on your shoes, and get out the door, and it's been great. And I really like that aspect of it. But lately, especially with trying to adapt to the cycles of 6 minutes on, 1 minute off, 1 minute walking, my body's like, all right, we need 3 to 10
4 or
business
5 days.
days
Right.
to recover before we do this again. Like, but I want to do 2 times or ideally 3 times just because I like it. But it's just I'm not sure what I'm doing that's off. on
So at
recovery.
this point, you are doing it roughly once per week then by default, basically, like you have to
Yeah.
rest that long in between.
Yeah.
And outside of that, then, is there anything else that is happening from like an exercise routine standpoint? I know you said you want to maintain strength that you've built up to this point as well. And if you worked with Robin, I'm sure that there was at least a discussion in terms of what are we doing resistance training wise, right? So what does that look like paired with that 1 time per week cardio at this point?
So with lately, I'm trying to get back to being consistent with lifting like 2 upper body and 2 lower body
Okay,
sessions
so 4 times.
week. Yeah, that I'm trying to get back to that. Lately, it's just been doing it 3 times minimum, which is still better than nothing. And I have a pretty flexible schedule, so it's just a matter of me just getting it scheduled and getting myself downstairs into my home gym to actually get things done. And I do know there are some lower body sessions where I'm like, cool, I'll do this in the morning, and then sometimes I'll do a leg day in the morning and then a run in the afternoon, which could be affecting my recovery after that. So I'm trying to switch that around.
To do running first and then lift later that day, or switch them onto different
Sorry.
days?
I'm sorry. Do like an upper body in the morning on the days that I run.
Gotcha.
To clarify, no, it's way too cold at 6:30 in the morning to go running right now. But so yeah, so it's kind of hard to figure out what works best for me. I can't necessarily afford one-to-one coaching right now. Hence, when you provided this opportunity, I'm like, cool, let me pick your brain real quick on this. So
Yeah,
thank you again
absolutely.
for setting this like kind of thing up.
Yeah,
It'll
and
be
I've
helpful.
got a couple of ideas, and that's really, that's going to be the downfall, I guess, or the limitation of these types of discussions is there won't necessarily be a follow up. Like I can give you some things to consider, strategies, and then it would be hey, go experiment with this on your own, make these changes, see what happens. Hopefully, it is beneficial. But one-on-one coaching would obviously entail next week we check in again, we figure out what to assess, reassess. Make some different adjustments. So for everyone listening, that's obviously how this is very different than actual one-on-one coaching. But the process is the same. Essentially, it's just like a one-time thing. And I have some ideas, things that are like churning through my brain in terms of, well, what would I do? Like, what manipulations could I make? What variables could we adjust so that those 3 things that I mentioned are, more optimized a little bit better, so that recovery is better, adaptation is better, and thus performance is better. And then you feel better as well, because one thing that we haven't discussed yet, but you did mention as part of your goals, is just kind of feel better in your body as a whole. And in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, it's not like this is how everybody experiences things, but confidence in our body often stems from not just kind of like how it looks or external perceptions, but internal perceptions of our confidence with the choices that we make regarding it, right? And around it and what we do with it. So if you feel like, yeah, everything that I'm doing, my plan is really sound and it's really beneficial and productive, then you're likely going to feel really good about whether or not it's going perfectly or not, like feel more comfortable in your body. So that's part of the goal and objective here too. So I guess one more additional follow-up, outside of just like if you're doing a leg session on the same day as you run, I'd imagine that day is going to be relatively tough on your body as a whole, but like your actual legs themselves, they're going to be tired, they're going to be fatigued, they're going to be sore. But if you're doing 3 lifts per week, are they upper, lower, full? How is that being split up? I'm assuming there's a second day at least where you're doing some lower body exercises that are not on a running day,
Yeah.
at the very least, right?
Yeah.
In those sessions, do you find that knee pain, that inflammation, what you are experiencing from the run that's kind of holding you back, is present there as well? Is it hindering or impeding your resistance training also?
That
Or is it
is
specific to like the running?
okay. Let me think about this for a second. Because I think just sometime last week, okay, so last month, not this most recent Monday, but the Monday before, I did a leg session in the morning and then I did a running session in the afternoon. But then 2 days later on that Wednesday, because like Wednesdays are generally like leg, lower body, and running is what I have been doing. But then like Wednesdays end up dropping off. So that Wednesday, when I do like lunges or squats, I'll feel tension in my knees. So it's like if like here's my kneecap kind of deal. Like I'll feel tension above, like and
Mm,
around a little bit. So I think it's more like tied to the quad muscles.
right.
And
Muscular, or could
yeah,
be connective tissue like,
yeah,
tendon, fascia, which is one consideration here where not just specific to running, any type of training adaptation, tend to see that there is a quicker response in a positive way, a quicker adaptation from a muscular standpoint, like a musculoskeletal system, as opposed to those connective tissues, the bones, the joint, the cartilage, things like that. That is often where we run into trouble, where we might be actually responding more quickly than that will. And certainly that's going to be an issue the older that we get as well, right? It's just like I was talking about 10 years ago, probably would have been fine. My joints wouldn't have hurt so much. Now they will. And people run into that all the time when it comes to like performance enhancing drug abuse, where like, yeah, you might get massive from a muscular standpoint really quick, but your joints and your ligaments and whatnot don't adapt that quickly. And that's when injury occurs. So where you're saying that's coming from does sound like it might be like an actual under recovery from the muscle, could be quad muscle, but also that connective tissue, which if that's the case, if we have to assume that that's the problem, right? Like your connective tissue or whatnot is adapting more slowly than your muscle tissue, how do we still work towards that goal of improving I think we would see a carryover effect from like your endurance as a whole to your heart rate not being as high. Because I think that's specifically what you mentioned. You don't want your heart rate to be as high before you get to, or as you're getting to those walking intervals, and you can just continually run while being more of like zone 2 as opposed to zone 3 or whatnot. And when it comes to training as a whole, obviously adaptations are specific. If you want to get better at running, you have to run. If you want to get better at lifting, you have to lift. But if we're talking about just cardiovascular fitness and improving kind of like our, heart health, improving our, VO2 max, that is when those other forms of cardio can come into play really, really beneficially, because they can bypass that high impact type of strain that gets placed on your, joints and muscles when you are running and when you are lifting. Now, I will say it's probably, there's more of a demand there from running than necessarily lifting because it's constant and repetitive, whereas lifting, you do some reps in a set and then you stop and you rest, right? So from that, we either have the option of, well, I know they're not as accessible as you said, but can we do other forms of cardio that are not running, that are more low impact, whether that be biking, and this one's the one that I wish everybody had access to, but it's the least accessible, swimming, you know what I mean? Because that's one that you can do with literally zero impact at all. But any other type of machines that you have available to maybe throw in an additional session per week, for now anyway, to get that heart rate, overall cardiovascular health and that fitness level up in tandem with maintaining the actual literal, like specific running performance without adding more of that volume with the demanding impact of running. Is that possible at this point?
I would say yes. It would be just a matter of me just getting my butt down into, like, for example, my work gym has both the treadmill and a Peloton kind of deal, or even
like an elliptical. Do they have one of that's fairly
yeah,
typical, I would say.
Yeah, they actually have quite a few cardio machines. They got treadmill, Peloton, elliptical, and a Stairmaster even as well.
Don't do that one.
But I don't like that one, but I'm like, I have stairs at home. I don't need to do a machine.
And as far as overall like impact goes, that's going to be maybe a little bit less, but the same as running. You know what I mean? It's going to impact those joints. Yeah. So that's an option, right? Clearly you can do it, but it's not the only one. Another thought that I had in my mind was, well, maybe if there is a little bit of that overuse, too much volume that you're not necessarily recovering from, then what's the first action that we can take is some type of regression, right? We scale back what we are doing so that we can increase recovery. So there's a number of different ways that you can do that with just the same your structure of running alone right now. I don't think necessarily adjusting the 3 resistance training sessions frequency wise, unless you were to tell me that like each session is 2 hours long and you're doing like 15 exercises and 10 sets of each, I would say, yeah, let's scale that back. But I'm assuming that's not the case, right? Those are probably reasonable sessions.
Yeah. No, I mean, with interruptions, it takes me about a little over an hour, but generally hours the average.
Yeah,
with
so
the
that's probably
rest periods.
Not too much. That's probably a reasonable amount of volume.
Yeah.
So it probably doesn't need to change. And again, if we're talking about specificity with what you're really trying to accomplish while maintaining strength, you can keep that resistance training the same, but specifically alter what those run intervals look like. A very obvious one, like the most obvious one in terms of regression, would be you're doing, you said 5 of them, right? That's what you have worked up to, 5 intervals.
Yeah,
5 rounds of.
Yeah, 5 rounds of those. Yeah.
scale that back down to 3 or 4. You know what I mean? Until that you start to notice, hey, I am not feeling as much knee swelling. Like my bounce back period is now 3 days as opposed to 5 when I can run again. And then maybe now you're doing 2 sessions of that every week and a half as opposed to once per week. And if you add up that over time, you're now doing technically more rounds, more intervals, more mileage, even though you're doing less per session, right? Because it'll increase or reduce the recovery time. You could also, and these things you are not just like a one only or one or the other. You could also like intertwine these approaches, but you could adjust the pace or timing of the specific intervals themselves, right? You could simply still do 5 rounds, but you're now running for 4.5 minutes and walking for a minute. Or, if you want to be really specific in terms of like the main outcome that you're looking for is keeping that, heart rate or improving on that heart rate control, improving your endurances. Well, I want to keep my pace up. Maybe you can keep that pace the same, but rest for 1.5 minutes, or not rest, but walk. You know what I mean? Give yourself more recovery in between so that you are more recovered. And that's an option as well. Technically, what I would think might be the best of both worlds is to reduce the number of rounds so that you're down to 3 to 4. That way per session you can actually give a little bit more as opposed to doing less in those rounds. And you could consider maybe doing 3 to 4 rounds of running at a faster pace for 4 minutes at 3.5, and then even consider resting or walking a shorter distance in between, right? So then you're getting a different type of adaptation metabolically from a cardiovascular standpoint that takes less time. It might be more intense on your cardiovascular system, but that's kind of the goal, right? To stress that without necessarily stressing the vessel, right? Like in your joints and whatnot, that's like driving, like we want to stress the engine, but not the wheel bearings, what I mean? If we want to think of our bodies like a car. So we can push it a little bit harder, but with less total time spent. And that'd be an option as well. And again, you could play around with that, seeing how your recovery looks in the days afterwards. And if you're able to do that, whatever it looks like, more frequently, then you're going to accumulate more volume over time if you have to rest less in between. So those things that you have, like, what interventions have you actually tried up until this point, other than just like, I'm going to wait until my knees stop hurting before I run again?
Well, waiting is obviously the easiest one.
Right.
I did play around with it. So I know last week I did the 6 minutes on, 1 minute off, so many cycles of that. But then this week on Monday, I did try the reduction in the amount of time that I was running. So I think that instead of like doing 6, it was like 4-minute run, 1 minute walk.
Mm-hmm.
The same number of rounds, but I did notice like, okay, knees aren't as angry after doing that.
That's good.
So I was like, all right, so maybe I need to do a little bit more of just the shorter run time until like the connective tissue actually fully develops.
Exactly.
Like even though I can't, because I know I've had the tendency where I'll do that and I'm like, oh, I feel fine. I can jump back up to the 6-minute runs. And then jump back to the 6-minute run, 1 minute walk, and then my knees are like, no, we still don't like this. I'm like, well, what's going on? So
well, that's the other, again, why we probably don't want to just take one of these approaches and use them in isolation. Like this is where if you're doing what you just described and also then using a second cardio session throughout the week with a different modality, whether it be elliptical, whether it be the Peloton or whatnot. And so you're actually still giving your connective tissue the same amount of time. It's maybe you're only running once per week for now, but with that reduced total, volume, reduced amount of time in those intervals, that now you're also getting just as much, if not more, probably arguably more, depending on what you do on the elliptical or bike, of that overall endurance adaptation, but recovering just as well or better from a connective tissue standpoint. You might find that, hey, after like a month or so, you can just actually bump back up to 6-minute run intervals and hey, I'm zone 2 this entire time. I'm not out of breath. My heart rate's not skyrocketing. And now my knees aren't as angry, right? It's probably unlikely to ever assume that if that's something you're experiencing and struggling with, it's probably not going to go away entirely. But if it's reduced and manageable, I think that's a goal that more people that's a realistic goal and framework that people should take and apply more often than they do, is that you're never going to be completely out of pain, like 100%. You're never going to get the exact results that we all hope for, like in a perfect ideal world. But if it's better than what it was before, that's real life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're very often, very rarely actually gifted kind of like the perfect scenario, perfect outcome. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different options there that you can incorporate together that might work. But all of that is certainly just one piece of the puzzle, right? Like we haven't even discussed the maybe most important factor here. And that's kind of like all of this work that you're doing. How is that being supported by like your diet, your nutrition, your rest, your recovery? Because it could simply be, hey, you don't have to do anything different. Maybe you just need additional half hour or hour of sleep every night. Maybe you need an additional 25, 50 grams of carbs every single day. So what does that part of your lifestyle look like outside of just like the training?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that because I know there's tendencies where like, oh, here's your solution for all the exercise, but ignore the rest.
Right.
Is sometimes people's reaction. Trying to think of words. I'm always on board with more sleep. Like my husband will tell you I'm happy to sleep like 9 to 10 hours on the weekend. During the week, like Monday through Friday, I'll get up with him at 5, so our bedtime, like we'll start getting ready for bed at 8:30. So the goal generally is to get at least 7 hours of sleep. For myself,
So
I know
like 9:30 to 5, 10 to 5 of actual sleep time.
yeah, but that's assuming my brain lets me fall asleep when when I get into bed. Because I know there have been instances where I'll be in bed by like 9:15, but then my brain's like, oh, let's rehash things from 10 years ago.
Right.
So and the next thing I know, it's 10:15. I'm like, come on, brain.
And that's not
Just sleep.
even considered, that's without like a phone being in your hand or like any actual distractions.
Yeah,
It's just
no,
like
like
being in your head, right?
yeah, the only electronics that we have are old school alarm clocks in our room. Like no TV, no phones. The phones are left downstairs on the charger.
Wow,
Kind of
that's
deal.
impressive.
So
Good
like
for you too.
yeah, absolutely no smartphones allowed in the bedroom. Not the only remotes we have are for our bed, so that'll adjust so that you can get the
Hmm.
ideal sleeping position. So I do try to be cognizant of like screen time before bed so I can like start winding down, but then my brain's like, it's quiet now. We're not distracted by the phone or other things, so let's think about all the things that we didn't think about during the day. But I'm digressing. I apologize. So yeah, so my goal for sleep is a minimum of 7 hours. I'd love to get more, and I would love to get like an extra half hour, make that 7.5 or even 8 during the week. So I got to figure that out. Nutrition wise, so I am up to, I'll just throw numbers out. Like my maintenance is like between 1,800 and 2,000 calories right now. I do try to get a minimum these days of 115 grams of protein. I love carbs. Give me 200 plus carbs, and I am a very happy woman. you know. Um, and then like I kind of let fats fall where they may, but like keep an eye on it. But I think generally it's like 50 grams on average. So I do try to.
And this is all something you're tracking all of this as well,
I
or
am.
is this just kind of more of like this is where you should be and eat intuitively?
I am actively tracking. I have been using my Fitness Pal for years, but recently made the switch to macros first, and I like it. I like
Good
it
for
much
you.
more than my Fitness Pal because my Fitness Pal, I'm like, this is just
Yeah,
obnoxious.
I don't want my page or my platform to end up be a bash, like a place where we bash anything, but I've always hated my Fitness Pal. I've never recommended it to anyone ever. And ever since I started using macros first, that's what I've since recommended everybody to. It's so much better.
Yeah, no, it was only recently I discovered the macros first because otherwise I would probably still be using my Fitness Pal just because it has all my data, over the
Yeah,
years.
that's the
So
thing.
that's
There's
that's
a
the thing that kept me stuck there.
There's a logical fallacy there. What is it? Something sunk cost fallacy, maybe? Same thing with people who are like, but I spent so much time with my coach or trainer, like I don't want to leave him. But it's like, but are you getting any
Yeah,
benefit out of it? Is it good? It's kind of doesn't make sense, right? The ends
yeah.
don't justify the means there, or the means don't justify the ends.
Yeah, you end up with this like feeling like you're like I spent so much time with this thing, but it's not been working for me, but I feel indebted.
Right, you're loyal to it for
Yeah,
no
yeah,
real reason.
exactly. Yeah,
Especially
I'm
my
like
fitness pal, it's a software. It's not even a person.
exactly. I'm like, why do I feel tied to this app? So I'm very glad I finally made the change. Like I said, no further bashing on the other one, but I'm just glad I made the switch.
1,800 to 2,000 calories, 150 grams of protein. How much do you weigh, if you don't mind me asking?
I
You said that's your
average,
maintenance, so I'm assuming you keep track of it a little bit, right? To just see if it's like
yeah,
moving in one direction or the other.
yeah, yeah, about 1,800, grams of protein. My weight fluctuates between, depending on the amount of sodium I found sodium and carb amount. I've really become a nerd with all the data points in the tracking apps.
Well, that's good. That helps.
It does. It
Until it
does.
doesn't. And there is a certain point where overanalyzing can kind of actually be detrimental. But for the most part, I
Yeah.
would say most people don't have enough data. So it's good.
Yes, I would agree. So my current weight, I promise I'm not dodging the question. My current weight is averages between 140 and 143,
Okay.
and that's honestly the heaviest I've been in my life. So that's another mental adjustment I've been having to make.
Yeah, that's a whole nother
That's a whole
conversation,
nother
right?
topic.
Yeah. But I think that the numbers do kind of line up just from my basic calculations that I do in my head in terms of where I think people should quote unquote be from a calorie standpoint, protein standpoint, based off of just body weight, which obviously doesn't tell much of anything really, but does give at least a starting point in terms of where those parameters should lie. Have you ever pushed food up higher than 2,000 calories intentionally?
Oof, intentionally? No, I
I'm
have
gonna
not.
guess no, given the fact that you mentioned that this is the heaviest you've ever been, and there's probably a little bit of there's some emotion regarding around that in
A
general.
little
That's a
bit.
very common experience, I would say, and if that's present, if that's been the case, there's likely been some form of diet culture influence over restricting food as opposed to
Yeah,
adding more in.
yeah.
Most of the conversations I have with people, the answer is the exact same. Like, well, have you ever intentionally tracked your food? I mean, you're doing so right now in maintenance, which is most people say no to that question when I ask. They have never done that before. It's only been to restrict to lose weight. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe we should try and figure out what your maintenance is. But with that, even though you're tracking and maintaining, if you've never actually experimented with, well, how high can I actually go while continuing to maintain, you might be missing a little bit of like this thriving area of kind of like I can really push my training performance. I can have a high energy, enjoy eating a little bit more because I get a little bit more freedom. I would say for you, mostly from actually a fat intake standpoint, 50 grams to me personally is doable, fairly normal. But that's because that's been my experience since I started tracking when I was in my low 20s as a man, boy at that point. I would say most female clients would probably that I've had have been higher than that unless we're at a point that we're like, hey, we need to really be restrictive on calories. And so there could be a potential that that is hindering some, let's just call it metabolic recovery as a whole, to just categorize a very broad concept that I'm talking about here, from a female physiology, where if you're sacrificing, or not getting in enough fat, there's some hormonal suppression that can happen that can probably end up being seen in your, I mean, the most obvious ways are going to be things like menstrual cycle health. That's
Yeah,
probably the most talked about, but maybe it also
yeah.
is kind of like your joint health, your connective tissue recovery, bone, prevention of osteoporosis, like all of these things, right? Now, that's not to
Okay.
say that it's for you or anybody listening, like, hey, if you're at 50 grams of fat, that's way too low.
Yeah.
But there's things to consider where, well, maybe if you do try and push calories up a little bit higher, maybe you see how you end up feeling in general. Maybe it also improves your sleep quality, your mental focus and clarity, your memory, if you're averaging 65, 70 grams of fat every single day, which isn't a crazy additional amount, but consistently getting in that much more. If you're like borderline of where it's like a little bit too low, and then now you're above it into that like really safe threshold, you're in the green as opposed to in the yellow. Like, how long have you been at that amount for? Fairly long time.
Um, yeah, I would say at least 6 months.
I wouldn't say that's concerningly long, but as a general concept, if we're with whatever we're doing, whether it be, too much training volume, any type of stressor, if we're like in that yellow, it's not really in the red, but it's also in the yellow, not in the green. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, sure, we're not in the red, but we're also not in the green. So if you spend more time in the green, maybe that's where a lot of these adaptations then can occur more productively, more efficiently. And then maybe, because there's probably going to be some consideration if you do try this, if you take my advice, hopefully you don't curse my name a couple months down the road where you're like, like, hey, now I'm 151, and it's all his fault. But you might then be able to experience those adaptations and then focus on, and I'm going to go through a period of actual quote unquote restriction for fat loss purposes directly. And sure, then you can bring the food back down and whatnot, and then, get yourself back to maintenance, but while also maintaining those fitness adaptations as well. So it might be worth, that's always an area of experimentation, right? I'm pro more food for many reasons. A lot of it is just stemming from trying to reverse that belief and that just instilled instinct now for people to restrict, but also because I have transitioned more into like trying to get people to like really thrive in their training performance. And it's like, again, if you've lived in the yellow when it comes to training performance and adaptation, you might be really surprised what it feels like to be in the green from fueling that. So it might be worth trying. And I'm not saying, I'm talking like, hey, you might push your food up to 2,500 calories. Like, that's a pretty big jump, but maybe you find that your weight stays relatively stable with those fluctuations, right? Maybe you're 146 to maybe even 145 to 150, but you're also able to eat 1,800 to 2,300 calories, right? Not a huge difference, but it's also not nothing. Again, that might nudge you into the green from the yellow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. No, I hadn't thought about the fat part of thing. Because it's always inundation with like protein focus or carb focus kind of deal.
Especially if you're
fats aren't talked about enough.
Yeah, because we know carbohydrates are obviously the main fuel source of all of our training. So if we want that to be optimized, yes, we want enough carbs. But if you're already in the green there, you know what I mean? Like, maybe you're not actually giving yourself additional benefit from going further into the green, right? And adding more carbs, maybe more fat helps a little bit more there. But regardless, I think in general, it's just more energy in as a whole. Like, if the calories come up a little bit consistently, that's probably one of the biggest levers that we have to pull in terms of I'm not adapting appropriately or how I want to be from my training. Again, that's one of those three buckets. Like, the recovery piece is huge. We've already talked about potentially manipulating what the training looks like, but what are we pairing that with nutritionally? So there's something to consider. Again, none of this is actually direct. I'm not your coach, so I'm not telling you to go eat more food and go gain weight, that's going to change your life for the better, but something to think about.
No, and you would definitely be the first person to actually tell me that eating more food and gaining weight has a chance to make me feel better versus all no, you got to be as thin as possible, which, as you said, is like one of those ingrained mindsets we're still trying to work through.
There's more voices echoing what I'm saying now that there ever have been, but it's very clear that still they are shadowed by everything else. Like, we're not screaming into a void, but we're screaming into a very large room with few people in it that can hear us. You know what I mean? So I'm glad you're one of them.
Yes. No, I am too. I've definitely, just a real quick background thing, because I know I've definitely underate, especially during my 20s. So finding this corner of social media where it's you and Coach Robin and the rest of the Levolution team, I'm like very, very grateful I stumbled across it. It's like one of the few good things to come out of social media usage.
That's awesome. I appreciate that, and I'm sure everybody else does too, especially as somebody who lately I have been somewhat burnt out. Like, transparently, part of the reason I started this medium of social media is because I don't like being on Instagram much anymore and creating content there, because it's hard, it's challenging, you know what I mean? It feels like we aren't reaching people like you know what I mean? So it's reassuring to know that we have, and that we are, and we will continue to be. So I'm definitely going to share that with everybody, because it's been a tough time in that space, just like tough time everywhere. Life is hard for everyone, right?
Yeah. life is definitely a little rough lately, but no, just grateful for you guys, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Are there any other, either about what we spoke about specifically, or anything else that you wanted to kind of just pick my brain about from a health, fitness? I mean, I guess it could be anything really, but I want to make sure that you walk away with this from at least something to say, hey, you know what? I feel good about trying these approaches. I have somewhat of a strategy in mind to carry out on my own.
Gotcha. No, I do think I got my questions answered. It's one fun thing about being a human and trying to figure out how to improve fitness overall is I can be my own science experiment. And
of one.
It's a fun thing.
Yeah.
But no, I definitely appreciate the input and the advice as to ways I can tweak things, like reducing impact on my knees to try and incorporate different forms of cardio. Though I will admit, sitting on a very narrow cycling seat for a half hour does not sound appealing to me, but I will
Trust me,
definitely
you
give
don't
it a
have to
try.
convince me. Still, I think I will eventually probably get to the point that you've gotten to, but I'm still that person who is like, I'm only running if somebody is
It's
forcing
chasing.
me to do so, right? Chasing me or something like that. I've tried it a couple of times, but I probably ran into the same issues that you did where, you know what? My ankles hurt, my knees hurt because I tried to do 3 miles out of nowhere at a fast pace where I hadn't
Yeah,
ran for 3 years. You know what I mean?
yeah,
So we all do it. We all get put ourselves on this pedestal and think that like, oh no, I am a machine. I still am 20.
yeah.
We're not. But
Your
that's
joints are
okay.
like, surprise.
We live and we learn, I guess. But if you feel comfortable trying some of these things and you do, I know that I said that there's no follow up, obviously, because we're not working together and this isn't actually coaching. But just like I tell all of my clients that are working with me, I try and be as available and accessible as I possibly can. Accessible, if something goes well or poorly, feel free to shoot me an email, shoot me a message on Instagram. Like I'm always as one message away as much as I possibly can be, because I want to, I know, hopefully make an actual positive difference here. So,
No, I really appreciate that, and I will definitely keep you posted. Sorry, my Fitbit's buzzing at me.
time to get up and move, get some steps in.
Sometimes the vibration isn't enough, except if unless it's an alarm, then it like really goes nuts. But no, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I will keep you posted on how things go with the tweaks to fat intake and variety of cardio changes. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, you're welcome. I look forward to hearing about it. And for anybody out there listening, if you found this discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe on whatever page that you tune in. And remember, there are no right answers. There's just nuance. I'm John Knoll. Thanks for listening.